It's been 2 weeks since I've seen you. I'm starting to miss you guys. Anyway, hopefully if we have no unexpected event like a terrorist attack, we shall assemble in our regular digs. What I would like to do again is to put the lecture online, particularly through a YouTube link. What we're going to be talking about today is the Palestinian question. Earlier in the semester we looked at the first chapter of this history, the birth of the State of Israel inside the British Mandate of Palestine. What we're going to do in this second segment is take up the second continuing chapter of this story. In particular, we'll be looking at the aftermath of the 6 Days War and how the Israeli conquest of neighboring Arab lands really intensified and amplified the problem of trying to assimilate Palestinian Arabs to some new political structure that would enable Israelis and Palestinian Arabs to live in peace. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut off the web camera. I find that rather annoying. And then I'm going to continue on with the lecture in its typical format. If I think about past exams, Ehud Barak, Oslo process, 6 Days War, often featured. This first question, why did Israel strike Egypt and its allies preemptively in 1960? That's been a question that's been asked before. The Intifada question, I've asked that quite a few times. The assassination of Rabin is mentioned a few times. So that finishes it for this lecture. Again, I'm sorry I had to put this online. Hopefully you can watch it on your own time. I'll put it both on the website and on YouTube. You can choose whatever medium you want to use to watch it. So sayonara, and I guess I'm recording this on Thursday. I'll see you tomorrow in class. Now, one of the things I find always very difficult about this particular series of lectures is that on the one hand the history is extremely complicated, so it's very difficult to condense into an hour and 20-minute lecture segment. The other is that the audience in Canada tends to be very much divided between Arabs and Jews, Israeli and Palestinians. And each of those groups, for their own particular reasons, of course, is extremely vested in this history and brings a lot of emotion to the question. This was one of my reasons for having you take the straw poll. We'll look for it at the end of the lecture to see how you judge this history. Who in particular do you hold most to blame for the Palestinian question, the continuing inability to resolve the conflict between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, the inability to create a stable political structure, two states, one for each nations. So it's going to be a lot to pack in, and frankly in the last 20-year period I'm going to be glossing over that relatively quickly. I just want to kind of highlight how the issue remains unresolved today, and perhaps when your grandkids are at the University of Ottawa, I mean, the history will still very much be the same. At least that's the trajectory it's on. Our principal point of concern is we're going to be looking at the 6 Days War, and what we're interested in exploring is how this, event, quite unanticipated, really reshaped the post-war Middle East. Second main thing we're going to be looking at is the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising in the occupied territories. This event really changed the international equation and set the stage for the Oslo process. And the Oslo process was the first, really tangible steps towards a solution. And to a certain degree, we're still within the Oslo process, or the fragments of it. It did not succeed, but it did put certain things into play that are still in existence today. So in terms of our topics, we're going to look at the 6 Days War and the subsequent Israeli occupation of Arab lands that were conquered. Then we'll be looking at the First Intifada. We're going to be looking at the Oslo process, its origins, its proposals, and try to assess why it failed. I just want to briefly turn to the Arab Spring because I think it's significant in the sense that Arab populist movements, which earlier had really gotten fueled by the Palestinian question, have increasingly abandoned the Palestinian cause or increasingly focused on their own political dilemmas. And at the end of the lecture, we'll have a few summaries about this presentation. Now, the 6 Days War happened in 1967. It's called the 6 Days War because it was a stunningly lopsided victory. It ended in a total Israeli victory within 6 days. And it was so lopsided that it really transformed the Palestinian question in many different ways. The 6 Days War had a complex set of origins. Israel itself felt very threatened, particularly by Egyptian nationalist president Gamal Abdel Nasser. And we'll be looking at him a little bit later in the semester, actually next week. Nasser was an Arab nationalist, and he was also an ally of the Soviet Union. By getting Soviet advisors, Soviet tanks, and heavy weapons, by creating alliances with Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and other countries, Israel became very threatened. Nasser really initiated the conflict when he used his position to close the Gulf of Aqaba. So if you go down here, the Straits of Tiran, one of the things that Israel was able to do was to block this, cutting off Israel's access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. In addition to this, Nasser was engaged in a public relations blitz. In particular, he took to the radio to swear the destruction of the Israeli state. Now, we know now from records that Nasser did not have any intent of actually attacking Israel. Israel, however, believed that an attack was imminent, that they faced a very dangerous threat. And believing war more or less inevitable, they decided to launch a preemptive strike. So early in the morning hours of June 5, the Israeli planes took off. They flew low over the Mediterranean. And one of the things that happened is that they achieved total surprise. They arrived over the Egyptian airfields almost unimpeded. They destroyed the Egyptian Air Force pretty much on the ground, killing a significant amount of the pilots as well. And the result of this was that Egypt had a very difficult time impeding the subsequent Israeli assault. I'm going to click on the video here and see if I can get it to play for all of us. Seems the internet connection is very slow for some reason. Alright, well, let's let that be then for now. With the Egyptian Air Force destroyed, it basically gave Israel a clear path across the Sinai. In particular, the Sinai is relatively open terrain. There's no trees. It's just sand. It's ideal terrain for tanks. And Israel was able to make rapid headway. They surrounded the Egyptian troops, and in fact the Egyptian army, which had been armed and trained by the Soviets, basically melted away. A lot of the Egyptian conscripts simply fled, abandoned their vehicles, tried to swim across the Nile. Israel also launched simultaneous attacks into Jordan, and they seized the strategic Golan Heights up here to the north. By the end of this period, basically the Arab armies had been completely annihilated. It says Al-Naqsa, I should say Al-Nakba. For the Arabs, this was not just a defeat, it was a complete and utter humiliation. Not only had they lost the war, they had been unmanned in the sense that they had Egyptian troops in particular just fled away from Israeli troops and not given an account for themselves. The victory was also very lopsided in the sense of the territory that Israel was able to seize. The massive Sinai area, you can see here, the West Bank of Palestine, which controls many water resources. The Jordanian watershed is there. So Israel got access to a lot of water it needs for its future development. And the strategic Golan Heights, which provided Arab artillery excellent views for striking Haifa and neighboring Israeli cities to the north. So the 6 Days War had various different consequences. One is that this is really the beginning of Israel emerging as a superpower. They had won the first war as well, but it had been a lot more even. From this point on, it became clear that the dream of reversing the Jewish state was going to be difficult indeed, and that in fact a military solution was not going to be possible for reversing the first Arab-Israeli war. The other consequence was that Israel was able to get its control over a significant amount of Arab territory. Initially, it was believed that the very lopsidedness of the conflict meant that Israel would be able to gain recognition from its neighbors because it would trade land for peace. In addition to the conquest of Arab lands, many Palestinian refugees were created. Again, there was another 300,000 refugees that were chased from their homes. They were not allowed to go back. In addition, many refugees from the first war that had been living in refugee camps in Egypt, also Jordan and Syria, were now under Israeli occupation, especially when the peace land for peace deal did not emerge. Now, many people thought that given the lopsided victory, of course, Arab states would be forced to recognize Israel, but at the Khartoum summit in 1967, the Arab League met, and feeling so humiliated and that they were in a weak bargaining position, they refused to negotiate, which created an impasse. Israeli troops were on this Arab land, and what was going to happen to them? One of the things that happened quite soon is that Israel began to settle this land. In particular, they returned to Jewish settlements that had existed before the first Arab-Israeli War. Although most of the refugees had been Arabs, there had also been Jewish settlements inside Arab territory, and they had been forced to flee. And now with this opportunity, particularly in the Hebron area, many Jews returned to their homesteads. The final outcome of the 6 Days War was the collapse of Nasserism, and I haven't really explained this. This will come in the Middle East lecture. But Egyptian President Nasser had basically articulated a vision of Arab nationalism that had extremely excited neighboring Arabs. And with this humiliating defeat, he was cut down to size, and his dream of reuniting all the Arabs under a single state was vanquished. Now, it was the Arabs that refused to negotiate with Israel, which created this impasse, Israeli occupation, over this Arab land. But it's also important to point out that Israel quite quickly gravitated to the position from trying or considering using this Arab land as a bargaining chip to viewing the occupied territories as a very viable resource for a greater Israeli state. And one of the things that's interesting is that Theodore Meron, who was a famous Nuremberg lawyer, was engaged by the Knesset and hired and consulted on this question. Would it be all right, by international law to establish Jewish settlements on Arab land. And what Theodore Morone replied was that no, that this was a violation of the Geneva Conventions and it was not allowed. However, this legal opinion was buried in the Knesset archives until about 5 years ago. So what is clear is that Israel was already in the very early stages weighing the prospect or possibility of transforming this Arab land into Jewish territory. We also have the story of the first Jewish settlement in the occupied land. This happened in Hebron just a month after the war was concluded. Initially it was said that this was just a construction site, and quite soon it was expanded out as to the first Israeli settlement. The settler movement would eventually become a much larger dynamic, in particular foreign Jews, American Jews, also particularly Jews from the Soviet bloc, were resettled in the West Bank where there was room and territory for them. Now there were various interest groups inside Israel that had a strong interest in cleansing and taking over these lands. Religious Zionists recognized that the historic heart of the Hebrew state of Israel was on the West Bank, the area which had the best water resources. So the way they looked at the West Bank was not that this was Palestinian territory, but this was the ancient Hebrew states of Judea and Samaria. Generals, too, argued that this territory should be kept. I mean, given that these Arabs refused to accept Israel as a state, they remained committed to destroying and wiping Israel off the map. Surrounded by hostile states, Israel needed to have a buffer zone. It's a very small, narrow state. If it was ever attacked, this would mean that the conflict would take place in Arab territory rather than on Israeli soil. Now, another very main component to the Jewish view of the value of the occupied territories has to do with water. In fact, several scholars have made the argument that you can explain all the Israeli Palestinian conflict in terms of water. And I think this is a gross exaggeration. But what we can say with absolute certainty is that the 6 Days War allowed Israel to get control over various freshwater resources, in particular the Jordan watershed, and also various underground aquifers. And many of these resources were harvested and redirected back inside Israeli territory to supply Israeli cities and agricultural enterprises. And that the future of the region, the future of the state of Israel, is very much tied to fresh water, given that it is a very acidic region. Now, another consequence of the 6 Days War is that it created a split between Arabs and Palestinian Arabs, those that had been living in the British Mandate and many of whom were now refugees. The Gaza and West Bank were now under Israeli military occupation, initially as a temporary measure, but this temporary measure endures to this day. Now, as a result of this, it became clear to Arab leaders like Nasser and Saudi Arabia that it was very unlikely that the Palestinian question would be resolved in their favor. Israel had essentially won the war, and it would be impossible to destroy the Israeli state. So this transformed the way Arabs looked at their Palestinian brothers. They looked at them first as Arabs who had been victimized by the West, that had been persecuted by the Jews. But now when they looked at the Palestinians, what they saw was basically a permanent refugee population, sometimes a state within a state, carrying on an informal war with Israel, a security liability. So they tended to look with much more suspicion upon Palestinians after the 6 Days War. So abandoned by its Arab allies, the Palestinians had to turn inward. They created their own kind of proto-state. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, which had been created by the Egyptians, became increasingly an instrument that spoke for the Palestinian people. Yasser Arafat, leader of the Al-Fatah movement, took over the PLO, and abandoned by his Arab allies, not having the resources to basically reverse the Israeli gains, the PLO adapted a guerrilla strategy modeled on the Algerian formula. In particular, they carried out terrorist attacks on Jewish targets abroad, the most famous of which was, of course, the Munich attack. The Munich attack, in which Israeli athletes were held hostage, and many of them died in a botched rescue attempt. Now, the Arab concerns of the Palestinians continued to mount, and they reached a boiling point, particularly in Jordan in 1970, where King Hussein of the Hashemite dynasty basically became worried that the PLO was an armed state within a state, carrying on its own war and agenda with Israel, endangering his monarchy. He used his army, he cracked down, he disarmed the PLO, he chased Arafat and the PLO leadership to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, which wasn't a very stable state to begin with, was increasingly destabilized, the PLO contributed to this dynamic that led to the long civil war there. Now, the 6 Days War had been such a humiliation that the Arabs sought to not only get revenge, but to essentially, if you want to put it in these kind of cultural terms, to regain their manhood. So this set the stage for the Yom Kippur War. Nasser's successor, Anwar al-Sadat, rebuilt his army with Soviet aid, and then he launched a surprise attack on the holiest day in the Israeli calendar, the Jewish calendar. And this attack caught the Israelis completely by surprise. It was really an intelligence failure. They had been way too lax. Sadat was able to get across the Suez Canal. He overran Israeli units. He killed and captured high-ranking Israeli officers. The Egyptian troops, if you can see it on the map, here's the Suez, here's these Israeli bases. They advanced rapidly. At the same time, Sadat's attack in Egypt was joined by Syria and Jordan, which also attacked. And Israel, which had many of its troops at home, was caught by surprise, flat-footed. It was initially in danger, but then quite quickly rallied. And by the time that the Russians and the Americans came in to declare an armistice, Israel had already turned the tide, and actually they were in the process of routing the Arab armies. And what both the Soviet Union and the United States wanted to avoid was another humiliation. So they basically forced an armistice on both sides. So what the Yom Kippur accomplished from the Arab point of view is that they restored their honor. They viewed this as a great victory, even though international community had saved them from an ultimate defeat. It created a bargaining position from the Arab point of view to now negotiate a peace with Israel. It also established, since they had failed once more to destroy Israel, that basically there was no military solution. Israel could not be destroyed. It was just too strong. Now, Sadat used the Yom Kippur War to basically launch a bilateral diplomacy with Israel. This got a lot of criticism from other Arab countries. In fact, Sadat would be assassinated by the Egyptian Brotherhood because of this deal. But what he was able to do was to basically regain the Sinai, the lands lost during the 6 Days War, by going to Israel, flying to Tel Aviv, addressing the Knesset in Jerusalem. he recognized the state of Israel in return for the Sinai Peninsula, this Arab land. And what's significant about this is that Sadat was the first Arab state to recognize Israel, and that the concerns of the Palestinians was completely ignored. In fact, Gaza, which had been Egyptian territory, was given over to the Israelis. The Egyptians just wanted to wipe their hands with the Palestinian cause, at least their leadership, more so than the people. So the 6 Days War had a major implication and transformed the structure of the Middle East. One of the consequences was that many Palestinians now lived under Israeli military occupation. In fact, this occupation lasted for over 20 years. By 1987, a whole new generation had been born in Israeli captivity. They lived in what was called the occupied territories. In theory, they were subject to Israeli military rule. They didn't have basic civil rights, representation, and there was no real, seemingly, solution to this impasse. Israel was increasingly incorporating this land into their territory, and this raised the specter. What was going to happen to the Palestinians living in this land? Despite international efforts to return the land to the Palestinians, this was blocked in the UN by the United States. And the frustrations were, as a result, mounting inside the occupied territories. So I want to show you a brief video of the Intifada. Let's see if the internet is operating now. I might have a problem here, huh? Obviously I do. Anyway, the Intifada, what this term simply means is uprising. And the uprising was basically triggered by a seemingly banal event, which was a truck accident, a traffic accident. There's many traffic accidents in Israel. There's narrow roads, there's very aggressive driving. But at the Eretz crossing, a Israeli truck hit a Palestinian car, and 4 Palestinians, including 3 children, were killed. And there was a lot of frustration at the scene. There was immediate rumors that this had been a deliberate attempt to kill the Palestinians. And during the funeral for the victims, it spawned a spontaneous demonstration, which quickly spread throughout the occupied territories, the Gaza and the West Banks. And often historians describe things in terms of triggers and conjunctural context. The truck accident was a trigger. This is what sparked the Intifada. But obviously there was a much deeper source. The deeper source was the frustration of ordinary Palestinians of living under Israeli occupation, having no basic civil rights, and with no resolution to the diplomatic crisis on the horizon. So the Intifada, this uprising, took many different forms. It was mostly civil disobedience rather than violence. Palestinians tried to boycott Israeli goods. They refused to pay taxes. They took off their license plates. They demonstrated at checkpoints. Its most violent form was really typified by young children, preteens, adolescents, 11, 8, young kids taking stones and throwing them at Israeli troops. So it was largely a civil disobedience movement following the Gandhi model, trying to not collaborate with the Israeli regime that was seen as illegitimate, and putting so much pressure on them that they could be induced to leave the Arab land. Now, initially, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, didn't know how to respond. I mean, they were an army that was built to fight the Arab armies, and they didn't really have the training or mechanism and means to deal with these type of popular demonstrations. Initially, they tried to use non-lethal methods. This included, trying to use plastic bullets to break up illegal or unsanctioned demonstrations. Another tactic which was used, and which continues to be used, was to use bulldozers to destroy Palestinian houses and to create defensive perimeters around Jewish settlements or army checkpoints, and also to close the checkpoints into Israel. The economy of Gaza, and Gaza has almost no water and very few resources. Most of its economy at this time was based upon irregular or small-time labor inside Israel. In particular, the Palestinians worked in restaurants and as maids inside Israel. And by closing the checkpoints, this was, of course, a pressure tactic to create economic harm, to try to encourage the Palestinians to end their disobedience movement, the Intifada. But the Intifada did not end. What happened instead is that it grew stronger. The Intifada became part of an international spotlight. People in Canada would tune in to watch the CBC on a nightly basis, to watch the Palestinian demonstrations and these confrontations between ordinary people and the Israeli army. And one of the things that really happened for the first time is that international sympathy really switched over to the Palestinians. Before that, there had been a lot of sympathy for Jews because of the Holocaust. And during the 1960s and 70s, when the Palestinians resorted to terrorism, there had been, again, sympathy for Jews as victims of terrorism. But what happened kind of for the first time is that people in the West started to look at Palestinians as human beings suffering from the occupation. It put a spotlight on the harsh Israeli regime and the dilemma of Palestinians living under the occupation. Another thing that happened is that the Intifada really galvanized the Palestinians. The Palestinians had been complexly organized, supported by other Arabs and different organizations. And what this experience of defiance really did is it kind of created them as a national group with a cause and grievances and political objectives. Whether they were living in Gaza, whether they were urban, or whether they were rich or educated, they all felt they belonged to the Palestinians. Another thing that happened, especially with all these news broadcasts, is that more and more people became critical of Israel. Even though Israel was using non-lethal methods, over 1,000 Palestinians died within the period of 6 months. Plastic bullets can kill. Many people were caught in the crossfire. Israel used targeted assassinations. This tended to impact innocent bystanders. Criticisms of the IDF also started to surface among Israelis, especially doves, people committed to peace, who criticized these harsh tactics that the Israeli forces were using. Now, nearly 6 months into the Intifada, Yasser Arafat made his first offer. We'll stop the Intifada if you agree to evacuate essentially the occupied territories. But Israeli Prime Minister Shamir rejected this. We do not negotiate with terrorists, and of course this might be true, but of course the real reason Shamir rejected it is because he was not willing to accept the UN resolutions. He was not willing to give up the Israeli land, and particularly he was not willing to give up the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, in which hundreds of thousands of Jews had come to live by 1988. So as a result of this, the Intifada continued and intensified, and Israel, which was now for the first time kind of a pariah in the international spotlight, tried to break the movement, and they switched to more lethal methods. They started to use live bullets to break up demonstrations. They used helicopter gunships to try to kill Hamas leaders of the Intifada. They started to use tactic called incursions in force, where they'd bring in military troops. They'd establish curfew. They would invade homes in the middle of the night, supposedly looking for bomb factories and weapons, although this was partially intimidation, just to annoy the Palestinians, to get them to cease from the Intifada. Now, as a result of this and the inability of these harsh methods to deter the Intifada, it began to transform the basic dynamic that had existed inside the occupied territories. More and more Israelis, particularly the doves, Israeli liberals, university professors, lawyers, leftists, started to complain and pressure their own government to change their policies. And what was interesting is that many hardliners had came to recognize that there was really no military solution to the Palestinian question. If Israel was going to have peace, they had won all the wars. If they were going to have peace over the longer term, there had to be a diplomatic solution. For Israelis to have peace, Palestinians need to have something as well. So they started to look at diplomacy as a potential track to resolve the Intifada and to address basically the Palestinian question. Palestinians themselves were actually jubilant, although they were suffering a lot because of the pressure the Israelis were putting on them. On the other hand, they were ecstatic that for the first time their cause was being heard. They had been abandoned by the Arabs. They had been betrayed by the West. Now, all of a sudden, the Arab streets, international leaders, the West was on their side, pressuring Israel to do something. And they felt that for the first time, they were making progress. So the Intifada was very important in setting up the basis for the Oslo process. And the Oslo process came into being in 1993, and to some extent we're still in the aftertoes of this process. Now, Oslo began quite off the map. The Intifada had somewhat died down, but it had put into motion this process where both moderates on the Palestinian and Israeli side really were interested in pursuing a diplomatic solution. So quite far off the international radar in Oslo, Israel's Peace Now organization, which was just a NGO, met with certain moderate leaders of the PLO. And what actually was interesting is that many of them had a lot in common. Not only were they moderates, many of them had been educated in Western universities. They tend to be quite liberal in their outlook. And they felt they had a lot of common ground. And what they both wanted to achieve is, how can we find some kind of solution to have peace between our peoples? Now, this Oslo meeting became a lot more significant when Yitzhak Rabin's government joined and essentially started to engage in diplomatic negotiations. Since the PLO was not a state, since Israel didn't negotiate with terrorists, this was the first time that Palestinians, not just Arabs, but Palestinians and Israeli leaders got together to talk about their prospective futures. So as they got at Oslo, they start to hammer out the outlines of a framework that would lead to a resolution of the Palestinian question. And what they got out of the hamper again was this old idea, which seemed to make a lot of sense: land for peace. In other words, Israel had won the war in 1967. They had Arab land, and what would happen is they would give this land back to the Arabs in return for recognition for its right to exist, diplomatic recognition. The Arabs would accept Israel's state. The Palestinians would abandon terrorism. So this goes back to this very old idea that goes all the way back to the Peel Commission in 1937. There would be a two-state solution. A Palestinian state would be created from these occupied territories, would be transformed into the nucleus for a Palestinian state. Now, if these basic parameters were, basically just rehashes of old ideas, what was new about Oslo was how does one get there? And the belief at Oslo was that, basically there had been too much mistrust that had been built up, too much bloodshed, too many betrayals, disappointments. So the two sides didn't trust each other. For an agreement to be reached on these difficult questions, for an agreement to hold, what you had to do was to transform the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. So what they thought would work at Oslo is, why don't we take baby steps? Let's work on things that we both agree that are relatively easy to resolve. Let's show good faith. We'll both give small concessions. And as we start to give small concessions, it will start to bury some of these deep apprehensions. We'll start to feel better, and we'll start to have greater confidence in the other side. And as we build up consensus, as the peace deal expands, then we'll reach a stage where we can deal with these very difficult issues. Who's going to get Jerusalem? What are we going to do about these Jewish settlements in the West Bank? What are we going to do with the refugees of the first Arab-Israeli war? So the Intifada had been very significant in establishing momentum for Oslo. In particular, what the Intifada had done is to create pressure and to transform internal Israeli politics to the degree that a majority had recognized, or was at least willing to explore, the potential of a political or non-military solution. One thing that was extremely important, however, in this kind of tentative consensus is that people trusted the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin had been a general. You could even call him a hardliner. He had fought the Arabs all his life, and what Israelis believed is, although they were apprehensive about Arafat, the Palestinians, they worried about terrorism, they trusted Rabin to pursue a diplomatic solution without ever sacrificing their security. So following up on Oslo, Rabin, Arafat met with Clinton, and you can see the picture to the right. This is them and their famous handshake on September 13, 1993. Many observers have looked at this famous photo and have imagined that they could, dissect, forecast the future from the very images depicted on their faces. Here's Rabin, seemingly grimacing, looking very uneasily, shaking hands, extending his palm to Yasser Arafat. He had fought the Arabs all his life to defend Israel. Now he was doing a deal with a committed terrorist. On the other hand, you see Yasser Arafat. He had been a pariah, abandoned by the Arabs, condemned by the West for terrorism. Now all of a sudden he was at the center of the international stage. Here he was in Washington at Camp David, elevated to a statesman, shaking hand with Rabin, essentially elevated to head of state, soon to be head of an autonomous Palestinian Authority. And of course Clinton, you can see him very impatient. Come on, guys. Monica's waiting for me in the Oval Office. So the handshake obviously set the stage for the first Oslo steps. In particular, Israel allowed Arafat to fly in and to become head of the Palestinian Authority. About 10% of the occupied territories, most of them urban areas in the West Bank, Ramallah, some other cities, were given over to local Palestinian jurisdiction. They got in charge of the police, the sewers, the water, other municipal areas. They were no longer under Israeli occupation. They were under their own government. From 1993 to 1995, both sides, Rabin and Arafat, tried to continue on the Oslo process, offering mutual concessions to try to get closer to this final understanding, a final deal. But what happened is that on both sides, militants, extremists, unhappy with this deal, feeling that this deal was unfair to their side, tried to sabotage it. Rabin was considered a traitor by many on the right-wing Zionists in Israel. Many inside Hamas, the more radical wing of the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, felt that these steps were insufficient, that the state of Israel itself had to be destroyed, or at the very least, the Palestinians need to have the right to return to their ancestral lands. So as a result, both sides committed atrocities. Palestinians continued with suicide bombings. Israeli hardliners attacked Palestinians, and this really spoiled the climate and was preventing this goodwill from materializing that was going to be crucial for hammering out a final deal. Okay, now what I want you to do is to look at this particular video. It is a YouTube video, a suicide bomber video from a Palestinian woman called Reem Riashi. And I definitely want to play this, so I'm just going to put it on pause and see if I can get the internet to work. Okay, I have the video going here. So this is the video that Reem Riashi recorded after going to an Israeli border station. She was going through a checkpoint into Israel when metal detectors discerned something. She claimed it was shrapnel from a war wound. They took her into changing room for a closer inspection, and she detonated her suicide belt, killing herself and 3 Jews. Now this video was released afterwards by Hamas, and it basically sparked a lot of controversy. I thought we could look at this video to kind of probe a little bit deeper onto the question of perspective and objectivity and angles of view. We're looking at the history more broadly of the Palestinian question. One of the things that's very difficult is to provide an objective account. If you're an Arab, a Jew, or a Westerner, your way you look at this history tends to be very different. So by looking at this particular very dramatic act, we can kind of get a sense for this diversity and point of view. Now when we look at this video from a Canadian perspective, I think the thing that first comes to our mind, if we're going to use a label, for example, we start to consider this person irrational or crazy. I mean, suicide is not something that is, rational. You don't end your life, and it seems to be very selfish to kill yourself if you're a mother with 2 little kids. Here you can see this picture of a little child carrying a mortar around. So from the Canadian point of view, when you look at this video, the filters that you apply based on your experience living in Canada, living in a society, a civil society of peace, this person is insane, crazy, a nut job of something. Now, this same act looks completely different when you look at it from a Palestinian point of view. From the Palestinian point of view, you still have Reem Riashi, you still have her blowing up and killing 3 Jews. But now the way this is viewed, because of your history, your experience, the tragedy that you have lived, Reem Riashi is not some crazy lunatic. She's a heroine. She's a freedom fighter. And she's a martyr. She's a freedom fighter in the sense that given that the Palestinians don't have a regular army, this is the only means through which they can fight. And that suicide is a type of self-sacrifice. That she was willing to give her life despite the fact that she loves her kids because she believes so much in the cause of her people. And if you looked at it from a religious point of view, you could say, well, this was an act of high spiritual consciousness that led to martyrdom for liberation of Muslims that are being oppressed by the Jewish state. Now, if you look this at from an Israeli point of view, Israelis that for many years, excuse me, were experiencing the terror. You never knew when you would go into a deli and someone would come in and blow everyone up. This image is extremely frightening because people like this mean that you'll never be safe. If a mother is willing to blow herself up, then these people on the other side are not human beings. They're essentially like animals, and they can't be rationalized with. You have to use brutal force to deal with them, and you can't expect to enter into diplomacy with them. So what you can see is that when it comes to history, events, even when we agree on the basic facts, when you look at them from a different angle of view, what is different is not the event itself, but the baggage that we bring to the question. And I think this is important to keep in mind when we look at the broader Palestinian question. But what's interesting is if you dig even deeper than that, there's even questions about whether any of these perspectives really do justice. I mean, who was Reem Riashi really? Now, one of the rumors that went around, especially in the Israeli press, is that Reem Riashi hadn't done this willingly. Her family, she was part of the middle class, and the typical profile of suicide bombers is that they aren't members of the middle class. And her family was horrified that she had done this, and they condemned this attack, and there was a lot of blowback from the West, Israel, even other Palestinians and Arabs, that this was a terrible type of act to commit, that it put the Palestinian cause in a very bad light, that she would make orphans of her children, for example. But one of the rumors making its way around in the Israeli newspapers is that Reem Riashi had not done this willingly, that she had been caught in an adulterous relationship with a Hamas leader, and that her husband had actually driven her to the checkpoint. I guess we'll probably never really know what the truth is. I think if you watch the video again, one of the things that does strike me is how on her face there's this strange smile that's present there. And this gets me to believe that there was something extraordinary or pressure acting upon her. This is not someone who seems to be very passionate about the cause. Her smile is almost a little bit sarcastic, as if she doesn't fully believe in what she's doing. But Reem Riashi, whoever she was, whatever she meant to accomplish with this act, probably took this secret with her to her grave. We'll probably never know exactly why she did this. Now, from 1995 to 1998, the Oslo Accords fell apart. This was partly as a result of suicide bombing from the Palestinians that were frustrated by the lack of Israeli concessions. Another very critical thing, and this might be an exam question, that really undermined the Oslo process was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in November 1995. He was killed actually by an American Zionist who considered him a traitor. He was shot dead. And when Rabin died, it seemed that it really undermined Israel's willingness to continue with the Oslo Accord. There had been skepticism brewing anyway, and many Jews had looked to Rabin as, kind of the broker for this peace, the person they could trust to carry it out. When he died, the momentum behind it left. Shimon Peres tried to keep going with the process, but there was an election in 1996, and the hardliner Benjamin Netanyahu won the election. Benjamin Netanyahu was a stringent opponent of the Oslo process. He didn't throw it out. He didn't kick the PLO out of the West Bank. He didn't stop the deals that had already been carried out, but he did essentially freeze the Oslo Accord. He wasn't going to continue on negotiating with the Palestinians. And as a result of this hardline stance, the Palestinian militants went on a wave of suicide bombing that shook Israel to the core. So this is the Al-Aqsa Brigade, Hamas as well. This made the hardliners in Israel dig down all the more. They froze any further concessions, and one of the things that Netanyahu did is he accelerated the pace of settlement. And particularly, he actively expropriated land on the West Bank. You can see Israeli settlements on the West Bank. He would kick off Palestinian farmers and establish townhomes for Jews, many of them religious Jews, who saw the settlement of the West Bank as a holy act, rebuilding the kingdoms of Judea and Samaria. But of course, Netanyahu didn't have any real solution for the Palestinian question. And as a result, Israelis were under siege, particularly by terrorist attacks from angry and desperate Palestinians. So Netanyahu lost the election in May 1999, and a relatively unknown Ehud Barak became prime minister, campaigning on a platform of relaunching the Oslo Accords and being able to deliver a final settlement. And this was something which Israelis in May 1999 had really come to hunger for. And this led to his very rapid elevation to prime minister. Now, Ehud Barak started to move very, very rapidly. He withdrew from Lebanon. He started to engage Syria about potentially withdrawing from the Golan Heights. That didn't eventually materialize. What he also did is he contacted Clinton. Clinton, who had been scandal-plagued, was reaching the end of his tenure, just hungered for rehabilitation. He could put the stain of Monica Lewinsky behind him by basically crowning himself the greatest statesman of the 20th century. He had an opportunity here to resolve the Palestinian question, and he took it. He invited Barak and Arafat back to Camp David, and he put both men on other sides of the table, and he tried to iron out the final grand solution. Clinton sprawled out the map of Jerusalem. He was taking color crayons and dividing out blocks and streets. And right when it seemed that there was a deal for both sides, Arafat said, I can't accept this. This is not enough. It does not meet enough of the Palestinian demands. If I bring this back, I'll be killed. And Ehud Barak said, well, what do you mean? I've already conceded more in this deal than any other Israeli leader. I've given you more than I was authorized to. I don't even know if I can sell this to my own people, but I'm willing to take the risk. You've got to man up. And Arafat says, well, I really appreciate your efforts. Thank you, Clinton. Thank you, Barak. But I can accept this deal. It doesn't provide enough, in particular for the refugees of the first Arab-Israeli War. So as a result of this, Camp David 2000 ended in failure. The best potential, the only real tangible moment where we had a chance for peace, ended in failure and impasse. Now, since that period, basically the Oslo process was dead. Basically what had been accomplished was there, but there was no further path forward. Barak very soon lost his election. He had failed to deliver the peace that Israelis wanted. The hardliner Ariel Sharon, won the prime ministership, in part because he destabilized the region and triggered a crisis of confidence in second election in Israel when he visited the Temple Mount in September 2000 with armed guards. This triggered a second intifada, and Sharon eventually defeated Barak to become prime minister. The Palestinians again continued with suicide bombings. On the other hand, Sharon was not deterred. What he had decided, his lesson from the second Camp David, was that it made no use to negotiate with Arafat. Even if you offered him the moon, he wasn't going to take it. This was a weak leader. Palestinians in general, you couldn't trust them. They were unreasonable. They didn't accept realities. So what Sharon's position was a kind of realistic position. He said, we can't negotiate with these people. What we're going to do is we're going to take the nucleus of the Oslo Accord and we're going to impose it with force. So the most tangible manifestation of this was the creation of a separation wall, a security perimeter, a large concrete wall that would prevent Palestinian suicide bombers from infiltrating into Israel and killing civilians. This separation wall was, however, constructed exclusively on Palestinian territory in the West Bank. The other thing that Sharon did is he withdrew from the periphery, particularly in Gaza, also peripheral settlements in the far West Bank, and he basically relocated all the Jews inside the security perimeter of the separation wall. And this separation wall, as you can kind of see in this map here, essentially what this is going to become, of course, is the ultimate frontier between the two states. From the Arab land, the occupied territories, Israel has now established a frontier around areas that are going to be Jewish controlled, and the rest of the territory is going to be assigned to some future Palestinian state, however that comes into being. Now, there was various reasons why this wall was created in this way. There were also various court cases that led to changes in its basic structure. But what it's essentially trying to do is to create a security perimeter around Jewish settlements and to control critical bridgeheads of the water infrastructure. Water holds the key to the future of both states. Now, Clinton had failed to resolve the Palestinian question, and as a result, President Bush came into power when Al Gore lost the contested election in 2001. And President Bush, quite frankly, wasn't very interested in resolving or reviving the Oslo process. The way he looked at it, if Clinton, with all his brains, hadn't been able to figure out a solution, how the hell was he going to do it? So what Bush eventually did, after being pushed by many Western leaders and also the Palestinians, was like, well, let's quit all this complicated stuff and maps and everything else. Let's just simplify the process. Let's declare a Palestinian state, let's declare an Israeli state, and let's see how we can get there. Which wasn't, a totally unreasonable thing to do at that particular point in time. His basic idea was that you had to find a formula where certain Israeli settlements were given up in return for Palestinian recognition of Israel. But Ariel Sharon wasn't interested in this at all. When Bush presented his roadmap for peace, he was ignored. Then 9/11 happened, and Bush was at war with terrorists. And when he was at war with terrorists, well, it was very hard to put a lot of energy to help the Palestinians, who had long used terrorism as a political tactic. So as a result, basically the Palestinian question has existed since 2001 in this kind of state of explosive irresolution. This has spilled over in various ways, including the war in Lebanon when Israel invaded Lebanon to try to seize control over rockets that Iran had brought into southern Lebanon to arm Hezbollah. Another major event that happened in 2006 is that the PLO, Al-Fatah, and Hamas, a more extremist organization, basically split apart. So Gaza and the West Bank split apart as states. In 2008, there was this very dramatic event where Gaza, which is under siege, under a military siege by Israel, because Iran is bringing in missiles to Gaza, but it's also a humanitarian crisis. They have no water, they have no food. Basically stormed the fences and crashed into Egypt for petroleum and food that they needed to survive. So when we look at the Palestinian question today, what we see is that basically the same dynamic that was present in the 1930s, the problem that arrived after the first Arab-Israeli war, the problem that arrived after the 6 Days War, it's still there. The Palestinians lost these wars. They have not been able to establish a state, and the challenge of trying to create a durable settlement is actually more difficult now than ever. You still have this fundamental dilemma: two people, one land, insufficient resources. Gaza is essentially a glorified concentration camp. It has no really water reserves, no meaningful economy or resources. And by 2025, the Palestinian population living under Israeli occupation will be larger than the Jewish population inside of all of Israel and the occupied territory. So this is an explosive situation. It's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And how will this be resolved? If we go to just kind of the last 5 years, the most recent events, one of the things I found interesting about the Arab Spring that we'll talk about later in the semester is that the Arab Spring as a movement really didn't intersect in any meaningful way with the Palestinian cause. This was not true of many other conflicts from 1973 on, where most of these wars, even if it was between Iran and Iraq, often had a tangent that was rooted in some way in the Palestinian question. The Palestinians, having been promised a state, having been mentioned as a possibility by the United States, has petitioned the UN for statehood. They have been recognized as an unofficial member. They've joined many UN bodies, but they don't have a state yet. Sweden is slated to recognize Palestine as a state. That would be the first Western state to do so. But the humanitarian situation, less so in the West Bank, but certainly in Gaza, is very, very dire. And they still live under Israeli military rule. Just a couple months ago, there was battles waging as Israeli forces moved in force inside Gaza, and battles were fought between Hamas and Israeli troops. So this brings to a close the second letter in the Palestinian question. Obviously, I had to go quite quick over the last few chapters of history, looking at it from a Dutch Calvinist American perspective. The way I see it is that the Palestinian question is really a tragedy. It's a tragedy in the sense that you can see both sides with a dream, and it isn't able to be realized. And you can see why it can't be realized. It's very difficult to reconcile these dreams that are really centered on the same land, the same holy sites, the same territory, the same resources. And there isn't enough water resources to really accommodate both dreams in both states. Now I do believe, especially when you look at the second Camp David, that poor leadership contributed to the impasse. I do believe that the second Camp David had the potential for lasting settlement, and Arafat, he blinked. Maybe he wasn't strong enough as a politician to have carried this idea to his people, to get his people to buy into it. But there's no doubt that this was the best opportunity for peace. It was probably the best deal that the Palestinians were ever going to get. Certainly whatever deal they get now on the other side of the separation wall is going to be a lot less than they potentially could have walked away from in 2007 at Camp David. But certainly this is true of other leaders as well, Western leaders. I mean, Clinton did try, Bush didn't try so much, but even the best diplomats, Carter and everything else. I mean, this is just a very difficult nut to crack, and we shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of trying to reconcile these mutually irreconcilable desires. So an enduring obstacle to peace is these occupied territories. These were territories that were conquered during the 6 Days War. Israel still holds them. They've assimilated some of these territories for a future state, but they still hold the majority of them. They would like to have a Palestinian state that accepts them and is willing to live in peace, but of course the problem is the Palestinians are not satisfied with what they've got, and the Israelis are not willing to negotiate in terms of the resources of the region, particularly water, to seemingly create the infrastructure for a viable Palestinian state with the remnants of these occupied territories. So this creates an impasse, but it's not just an impasse, it's a powder keg. And this time bomb, which we can see in Gaza, the standard of living is crimping. Gaza is a glorified concentration camp. It's extremely difficult, miserable living there. The living standards are plunging. It requires significant amount of aid. There's a blockade, however, on aid because Israel's worried about Iran bringing in missiles and Hamas firing these missiles at Israelis. So this is really a ticking time bomb, and we're, in our lifetime, we're going to continue to see this history play out and again, this cycle of violence, until there's a permanent solution. I don't know what the permanent solution is going to be or if that's going to happen in our lifetime. Now, one aspect, of course, that's very difficult for Israel is that this was a Holocaust state. This was a state that was created as a refuge for Jews. But now the conditions for Palestinians are, terrible and brutal. They're awful. Living in this, concentration society. They don't have basic civil rights. They don't have democratic rights. And the humanitarian conditions are declining rapidly. This isn't getting any better. The population in the occupied territories, particularly Gaza, is rising very, very fast. So what's going to happen to this humanitarian crisis? Can Israeli democracy survive if half of this region, half its population, the Palestinian Arabs, are denied their basic civil rights and are second-class citizens living in abject poverty and imprisoned? Things when you look at the history of the Palestinian question is that there seems to be no neutrality. If you're a Jew or an Arab, a Palestinian, or an Israeli, you tend to look at this history from the perspective of your own interests and history. So one of the things that we can do as historians trying to be objective is trying to understand how both groups look at this history and see how this perspective shapes contemporary politics and complicates the process of resolving the conflict. So, comme habitude, we have our key terms and review.